The year is 1979 in Moscow. A new and ambitious film is set to be released, going before the artistic council that the Soviet Union used to censor creative works. Despite all of the efforts of the cast and crew, the film outraged the council with its lack of dedication to Soviet values, shirtless men, and violent fight scenes. They demanded that it be shelved and never be seen by the general public. Somehow the film was seen by Comrade Brezhnev, and by being a gigantic alcoholic slug, knew instantly that the film was Soviet cinema gold and ordered it released. The film, 1979's Pirates of the 20th Century, became one of the greatest Soviet action films in a manner similar to that of Star Wars in the US, and helped create a new Soviet karate boom similar to the release of the film Enter the Dragon by Bruce Lee. No one was happier than one of the actors catapulted to stardom, martial arts proponent and actor Talgat Nigamutlin, who was the villain in the film, and whose martial arts skills would give him the nickname the Bruce Lee of the Soviet Union. Fast forward a few years and the police would discover Nigamutlin murdered in an apartment in Lithuania. It was a shock, but things were only going to get more strange. Soon it would come out that he had been beaten to death. Who could beat a martial arts expert and action star like that to death? They revealed that he had been killed by members of a strange cult that Nigamutlin had willingly joined, confused people even more. People wondered why a famous actor would feel the need to hang around strange esotericists and cult members quite like that. He was famous, beloved among the people, and had the type of influence that would keep him protected from the authorities. In spite of how it seemed on the outside, if you looked into his past, his actions seemed a little bit more obvious.
Charlie Dogwood.
Talgat's father was a Crimean Tatar, an ethnic group that Stalin forcefully deported to Central Asia in 1944. Tens of thousands died, and the ethnic group was totally removed from Crimea. He worked in the mines of the Kyrgyz SSR, toiling for a country that would never allow him to return to his homeland. He died in a tragic accident when Talgat was 2 years old. His Uzbek mother found it difficult to raise two sons, and so she put him in an orphanage. As a child, he was shy and frequently sick, even ending up with rickets, which left him bow-legged. He couldn't even speak proper Russian. He replaced this lack of physicality with a love of creativity, writing poems and attending drama classes. Soon he had taught himself to read, write, and speak good Russian by copying War and Peace by hand. One day at a dance, a girl refused to dance with him, so he ran off crying. That was the day when things changed. From that day forward, he dedicated himself to becoming healthy and strong. He didn't want to be shy, weak. He took up ballroom dancing at first, ironically similar to Bruce Lee, who was an expert in the cha-cha. He added in track and field before settling into karate, something that was growing in popularity at the time before it would end up being banned alongside bodybuilding in 1973. But even beyond building up his body, he dreamed of becoming a film director. Being a director meant that you had to go to the All-Union State Institute of Cinematography in Moscow. There was no other pathway available. Attendance and graduation was mandatory. But Talgat didn't get in. Instead, he ended up at the Moscow Circus School. Yes, seriously. Where he ended up becoming a championship wrestler. After a while, he did get into the film school and ended up in his first film not long after, as an actor rather than a director. 1967's The Ballad of the Commissar, where he played an evil White Russian officer. This role had the effect of starting his career in the film industry, but it also typecast him as a nefarious villain. Throughout his life, he would star in 40 films, and over time would grow in fame, starring oftentimes in films set in the Austern genre, the Soviet equivalent of American cowboy westerns, but set in Central Asia rather than the Wild West. The 1970s would be when he lived the actor's life to the fullest, going out drinking, having numerous affairs, and getting married and divorced 2 times over. He also spent time mastering judo and kung fu to build up his martial arts repertoire amid the karate ban. When karate was re-legalized in 1978, it coincidentally coincided with the production of a film that Talgat Nigamutlin had been brought on for, acting as the villainous foil for his actor buddy Nikolai Yeremenko. Pirates of the 20th Century. In the film, Talgat plays a pirate who fakes his way onto a ship carrying medical opium to steal the shipment. There's quite a bit of violence and, naturally, martial arts as well. Both Nigamutlin and Yermolenko were enthusiastic in the project, so much so that they performed their own stunts and had no body doubles. In spite of initial struggles with censors, the film turned out to be a fantastic blockbuster success after Comrade Brezhnev gave him the green light. The film was a phenomenon that rocketed Talgat Nigamutlin to superstar status, giving him the nickname the Soviet Bruce Lee. In fact, the film so thoroughly popularized karate again that karate was banned once more by the Soviet government in 1981. Not long after this roaring success, Talgat was at a party with other actors and film notables. In the corner of the room, he could see a man surrounded by a crowd of people. They listened in silence as the man spoke. Something hooked Talgat. Something interested him. Then, a strange man lifted a glass of water above his head and poured it over himself. He grinned and said, "Tomorrow you'll be speaking about nothing else." When Talgat went to go home, he boarded a bus. Remember, this is the Soviet Union, so even famous actors had to use buses occasionally. And when he got off at his bus stop, the strange man from the party was standing before him. This little man was clearly targeting the newly famous Talgat. But for whatever reason, the actor who had grown up without a father or much direction in his life seemed to latch on to this stranger. This stranger was, as it would turn out, was one of the first cult leaders that would pop up in the Soviet Union. Since the 1960s, the Soviet Union had begun to have a small, esoteric cult on the ground begin to form. The Yuzinsky Circle, established by Evgeny Golovin, would later end up as the esoteric, magic-focused Nazi faction, known as the Black Order of the SS, just to give an example. But in this case, the man wasn't just the most influential man of a circle, but a budding cult leader, arguably the first in Soviet history, Abai Borubayev. Borubayev was a beneficiary of two aspects of the Soviet Union. Firstly, that many esotericists and occultists had been allowed to pop up in the Soviet Union, particularly in the western parts of the USSR. Secondly, was something related to how the Soviet state tried to manage Islam in Central Asia. Government intervention into religious practices perverted the Muslim leadership in the region because they tried to control the people with corrupted leaders. Instead, the people, especially Sufis, largely placed faith in unofficial leaders known as Ishan, and were often heterodox in approach. Abai Borubayev came from a family who were deeply enmeshed in the party, and in any other situation would have been set up for success, since both his parents were relatively influential party members. Instead, he was very shy as a child, often suffering from bouts of sadness and isolation from others. He only ever had an interest in animals and stayed away from people. This shocked his parents, so they brought him to a doctor and even had him locked up in mental health clinics. It was only when he was a teen that his parents took him to a Muslim religious leader who took him under his wing for about 6 months. Afterwards, he had a quiet confidence about himself. It was as though he was a different person altogether. His parents, relieved that their son had been mentally restored, made sure to get his education finished up at a university and put him in a cotton mill, leading the Komsomol unit there. They had really set him up for success. But he still had an interest in occultism, less so traditional Sufi Islam, but something else entirely. By the mid-1970s, Abai had been sent to Moscow to a research group headed by a philosopher and psychologist, Alexander Spirikin, who headed a unit of researchers studying various parapsychological concepts like telekinesis on some the men who stare at goats or MK Ultra type shit. While Abai was able to make friends with at least one of the participants, a mystic popularly known as Juna, who had a lab funded by Brezhnev himself, Abai didn't last long in the program, and ended up back in Central Asia, leading an expedition searching for other spiritually powerful individuals. At the Sultanuvais Bobo complex, he met a man by the name Mirzabai Kimbatbayev. Mirzabai was a dedicated religious figure, wandering the temple complex and begging for alms, also likely providing healing for a fee. He was more of a traditional Sufi figure, and quickly became a spiritual mentor to Abai. However, for whatever reason, Abai Borubayev became the superior of Mirzabai, with Mirzabai calling Abai the chief dervish of the Soviet Union. The pair peddled their religious and spiritual teachings, portraying themselves as spiritual masters, managing to get into the circles of notable figures in the Soviet Union. Soon, Abay Bodobayev consolidated his control over a circle of followers in Moscow, giving his group the name The Fourth Way, borrowing from Armenian mystic Gurdjieff, and not Sufism. In due time, they were opening branches in many different Soviet cities, and the group was on the rise, targeting the intellectual creme de la creme of Soviet society, drawing the disaffected Soviet elites, promising them a world beyond the Soviet normality and evil capitalism of the Americans. It was then that Abay poured water on his head and met Talgat Nigamutlin. Nigamutlin quickly fell under the influence of Abay. He saw Abay as a genius, spiritual teacher, and would do anything that he commanded, almost seemingly taking Abay as a father figure, despite the fact that Abay was younger than him. There in Abay's The Fourth Way, Talgat Nigamutlin was introduced to a world that he had never known. Abay was a spiritual teacher and helped his followers expand their spiritual powers, but they also engaged in group orgies. To make a very, very long story short, details about the cult's actual practices and ideas have largely been lost to time. Only bits and pieces of Mirzabay's takes on religion seem to have survived. In his conception of spiritual teaching, he focused on shattering the self-perception of an individual. Sex, pleasure, power, and money were 4 psychological triggers that could be used to aid in self-realization and end the mirage that they had found themselves in. But that's all we know now. What a self-realization looked like or how these triggers could be used to aid in that remains essentially lost to time and is too obscure to find on the internet. Even the exact timing of Talgat falling under the spell of the cult leader Abay has several different offered time periods. Regardless of when this happened, Talgat fell head over heels for the teachings of Abay. Mirzabay was still influential and seemed to be an obstacle for Abay in expanding his power, which he increasingly demanded more and more of. Soon Abay became interested in not just control over the power of the direction and the teachings of the cult, but also over the members themselves. No one showed this increasing control more than Talgat Nigamutlin, unfortunately. Talgat faithfully promoted his guru and the Fourth Way group whenever he got a chance, especially to other artists and creatives. Talgat had even been giving his royalties from his films with Abay to use as he saw fit. He spoke highly of Abay and referred to him as the, quote, Christ of our time. In reality, the treatment that Talgat was subjected to was much worse than anything Christ would ever inflict upon even his worst opponent. Abay forced Talgat to go through with humiliation rituals. He was made to beg at the market and humble himself, diminishing his personal stature before the public that loved him so much. Somehow, Talgat came away with a positive impression of the humiliation and thought that foregoing his pride was a sign that he was advancing spiritually. Abay Bodobayev took the place of Talgat's long-dead father in his heart. Abay, for his part, didn't treat Talgat in a special manner, and only saw him as just another source of amusement and money. On one occasion, Abay, who was living with his parents still, smashed all of his parents' expensive crystal finery and some of their best furniture, and then walked out into the street stark naked. He was immediately sent to a mental hospital, and after he called for Talgat, Talgat was able to bribe one of the doctors and get Abay released into his care. For several months, Abay lounged about at Talgat's home, and both Talgat and his wife saw to Abay's needs for his recuperation after such a shocking incident. In reality, though, he had planned to do this from the start, since now he was listed officially as a mentally ill person. He no longer needed to work since he couldn't be convicted of work parasitism, and he could spend his time doing whatever he wanted. Venera Nigamutlina, the third and final wife of Talgat, and a renowned actress in her own right, had even stated that Abay had proposed that she run away with him and become his wife. Talgat never found out about that incident, however. For very understandable reasons, people found his new friends strange and thought that they put him on drugs. Both the way that he acted and what he professed to believe in didn't seem to make any sense to the people around him. Talgat, in their mind, shouldn't even be hanging around weirdos like that. He was a cut above, so why was he hanging around with the weirdest, most unhinged people around? It confused and concerned everyone around him, but at the same time, no one in the Soviet Union was used to the concept of a cult leader or a cult. For them, this was just a very strange and very off-putting spiritual leader who had crossed paths with their friend. They just assumed that things were odd, but not evil. He was already in too deep anyway. They were so influential that if someone objected too much, Talgat would feel obliged to to push that person away. One of the only pieces of internal friction in the group was Mirzabai. Reportedly, around about this time, Mirzabai still held influence over the group, and the villainous section of the Fourth Way was under his leadership, and not Abai. He was a more moderate figure by all accounts, and seemed to have been gradually disassociating from Abai as the 1980s rolled on. However, more than anything else, more than the power over his cult members, more than the money, the one thing that Abai wanted at the time was to establish what he called a human research institute, which would essentially engage in the same sort of parapsychological research that Abai had been engaged in back in the 1970s in the government-funded lab. This was to be Abai's lab, however, so it required more and more money. This meant that Talgat and the other so-called students of Abai had to pay more and more sums of cash to get what their spiritual master wanted. In spite of the large piles of rubles that Abai demanded for his pet project, somehow Talgat was able to find funding to accomplish his life's work, the thing that he had set out to do all those years ago when he was just a boy. Become a real film director. His film, Echo, was going to be his mark on the world. This was the proof that Talgat Nigamutlin could be a great director and a dramatic actor. The film centered around a man who came back from the Second World War. Naturally, this is the Soviet Union, and that was about half of their identity. And his father ends up telling the man that he was the only soldier from the village to return home from the war. So he's left distraught and goes on a journey. It was intended to be experimental to some degree, and he was casting both Abai and Mirzabai in the film. Neither of them had any idea how to act, and Mirzabai was semi-literate at best. Abai was frequently drunk on set and wandered around naked. This and his generally off-putting attitude made people on the project very annoyed. Talgat, however, was incapable of seeing it as anything other than proper conduct for the guru. In spite of being warned that Abai and Mirzabai were not fit for the film, Talgat pushed through anyway. The film was released in 1984 to a largely poor reception, and the film is now almost impossible to find. In early February of 1985, he got a phone call from Abai demanding that he come to Vilnius. Despite the fact that his wife and young daughter were both ill at the time, and he was finishing shooting on what would become his final film, Talgat dropped everything to show up in Vilnius for his guru. He almost missed his flight because he spent too much time at the market buying gifts for Abai and the others. But when airline employees heard that Talgat Nigamutlin was going to be flying that day, they made sure that he was going to be able to board his flight and held the plane for him. Unfortunately, this would be the last time that he would see his wife and daughter. Unbeknownst to Talgat, the cult had begun to disintegrate as Abai's greed grew. In Vilnius, there were people that offended him greatly, more so than anyone else. This husband and wife had taken money from Abai that he had claimed as his own. Though Talgat didn't know it at the time, he was intended to be the lead muscle on the operation to get the money back from the two schismatic adherents of the guru Abai. But when he arrived there, he refused to beat the husband and wife. He said that there could be a discussion and that a deal could be worked out. In that moment, the whole shakedown operation broke down. Without Talgat's support, none of the men were willing to take action, and before they knew it, Talgat had his hat snatched by the man's wife, and she ran out onto the street. He followed her, and while that happened, as the story goes, the man threatened to call the police. Abai and his other followers grumbled and walked off back to their hideout in the city. How long it took for Talgat to get his hat back is unknown, but by the time he arrived at the hideout and swung the door open, what was to happen next had already been decided. Abai shouted, "Traitor!" and the men descended upon him. There were 12 men there that night, including a trained karate expert like Talgat, a Russian man named Vladimir Pestretsov. They beat Talgat without stopping, taking turns when they got winded, but no one attacked Talgat harder than his guru Abai. The others didn't have their hearts in it. As they would testify later, they didn't want to disobey their master, and if Abai had waved his hand and said the discipline was over, they would have stopped attacking him immediately. Some claimed that it felt like Abai was controlling them telepathically, and he pushed forward with the beating as the evening wore on. Talgat sat there and took it. He didn't hide himself, he didn't protect himself, and he didn't beg. In the middle of the beating, there was a sudden knocking at the door. They quickly hid Talgat behind the couch and then opened up the door. It was the police. They heard someone screaming. When they saw the odd look of the men and their disheveled state, they simply assumed that the men were drunk and left them to their own devices, unaware that a Soviet film star was being beaten in the apartment. Abai ordered that the beating be resumed. They continued for the rest of the night like that, and into the morning. At some point, Talgat had descended into unconsciousness, and then they started to freak out. Trying to think fast, they put him in the bathtub in the hopes of waking him up. They had no luck and deposited him out onto the street. The apartment's owner from Abai's group called the police, feigning ignorance at what could have happened to the man who had been left beaten and then found outside the apartment. But there was no luck for them. The police quickly figured out that the group were the ones behind the beating and took Talgat to the hospital. He was still alive. Barely. Talgat Nigamutlin had 119 distinct wounds on his body, in addition to a broken nose and multiple broken ribs. After only a few hours in the hospital, he succumbed to his injuries. The news began to spread immediately. Talgat Nigamutlin, the karate master and actor, known all throughout the Soviet Union as the Soviet answer to Bruce Lee, had been found dead, beaten to death by men that he considered to be his brothers, on the orders of the man who had become his spiritual master. His body was so thoroughly damaged that his wife Venera Nigamutlina decided to have him cremated. The fallout of Talgat's death on his family was tremendous. Venera went through a period of deep depression and ended up losing contact with Talgat's family over how things turned out. The only thing that could motivate her was a desire for revenge against her husband's killers. The first initial trial found the killers all insane and sentenced them to compulsory treatment in mental hospitals. But for the widow Venera, this was not acceptable, so she pushed hard for a retrial, which she did get in 1986. Mirzabai, who was regarded as having detached himself from Abai by many inside the cult, was given 12 years and was able to survive until 2006, still working as a religious leader. The other killers had been sentenced to no more than 13 years, but Abai received 15 years. Unknowingly to everyone, and Abai himself, he had been sentenced to death. Abai would die behind bars from tuberculosis 3 years later. Though as the rumors tell, there was no tuberculosis at the prison that he was sent to, and instead, someone at the prison finished off the guru with a shiv. Supposedly, Abai's reason for killing Talgat went deeper than refusing to participate in the shakedown. He had seen a magazine called Soviet Screen that featured Talgat on the cover, arguably his most famous photo, and it set him off. Then, when he walked with Talgat in Vilnius before he tried to set Talgat on the husband and wife like an attack dog, several people walked up to Talgat, begging for his autograph. It was as though Abai was invisible next to him. Abai demanded total subservience, total service to him. He wanted submission, and for a man like that, a shining star like the Soviet Bruce Lee was far too bright to ever surpass, no matter what he did to him. Talgat's one refusal of his master, and his master's jealousy boiled over that night. That was easy enough to answer, but why didn't Talgat fight back? The truth of the matter is that we have no idea. There is no one good answer. It has been forever obscured by time and by the death of the only one who could have answered the question, Talgat Nigamutlin, the Soviet Bruce Lee. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video. Also, feel free to check out my Twitch and stream VOD channel. All links are in the description. Without further ado, check out this video, it's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.